Greetings, students. We're now going to learn how to evaluate a syllogism for validity. And in doing so, we're going to use Aristotle's method, which consists of a set of rules. And in fact, how we'll do it, we'll have a pretest and 6 rules that you have to learn. And once you put an argument into standard form, if a syllogism passes the pretest and passes all 6 rules, then we know we have a valid syllogism. Now, nota bene, you have to memorize these rules and know how to apply them for the test, or even better, for evaluating arguments in daily life. You also need to be able to recognize the fallacies and name them. So, the pretest. A syllogism must contain exactly 3 terms used in exactly the same sense throughout the argument. Now, in essence, the pretest is just asking you if you've placed the syllogism into standard form, or if it's a standard form syllogism. Consider the following. And also note, I've sent you a worksheet that you can use while you're watching this lecture that contains all my examples, gives you space to take notes, and gives you a space to put up the counter examples we'll sometimes look at. So you want to pull that out, or print it out if you haven't printed it out yet. Put it up on the screen, or however you're going to handle this, right? So, consider. Every hobbit loves second breakfast because all hobbits are eternally hungry, and all inhabitants of the Shire are lovers of second breakfast. Now, we put this into standard form, and it becomes all Shire inhabitants are second breakfast lovers, all hobbits are eternally hungry beings, therefore, all hobbits are second breakfast lovers. And as you note, it has 4 terms. But a standard form categorical syllogism can only have 3 terms, so this is not a syllogism, and it gets rejected by the pretest. But we also use this pretest because of a more common error that occurs in making arguments, which is called the fallacy of equivocation. If you'll note here, a fallacy depending on the double meaning of a word, mistakenly equating 2 different meanings of one word, so that there's an argument that uses one word to mean 2 different things. Like in our little cartoon here. Hey, you can't just take that. It's stealing. So what? They steal in baseball all the time. If it's okay for baseball players to steal, logically it's okay for me to steal too. And the store owner who never studied logic says you have a point. Now, we say the robber is equivocating on the term stealing, using it in 2 different senses. I suppose someone argued that since every good law is a moral law, and the rule of gravitation is a good law, it follows that the law of gravitation is a moral rule. And we put this into standard form. All good laws are moral laws. All the laws of gravity are good laws, so all the laws of gravity are moral rules. But here, the term laws is being equivocated upon. Right? So this really has 4 terms, since laws is being used in the major premise. Laws is being used to mean directives by human authorities. And in the second premise, laws means the observed regularities of natural phenomena, which are really 2 different things. Or consider this one. All men are rational beings. No women are men. No women are rational beings. Right? Here, the term men is being used equivocally. In the major premise, men equals human beings. In the second premise, the minor one, men equals male of the human species. So if we translated this thing correctly, it would look like this, and we would clearly see we had 4 terms, and it won't compute in our system. All humans are rational beings, no women are male of the species, no women are rational beings. Besides that, the argument makes absolutely no sense. Now, any fallacy that fails the pretest is said to commit the fallacy of the 4 terms, or in Latin, quaternio terminorum, because some of these became so famous back in the Middle Ages, they gave them Latin names. And in fact, if you want to be liberally educated human being and show you've been to college, recognizing the Latin names of the terms is one way to show that. And often when you're reading magazine articles, newspaper articles, and so on, they will often assume you know the Latin. Now, as we go through these, remember to refer to the sheet I sent you. Here it is. Let me see if I can get it shown on the camera and have that thing out, because my examples, or most of them, will be on there. Okay? Now, our first rule is that the middle term must be distributed in at least one premise. And the associated fallacy is the fallacy of the undistributed middle. Now, take this argument, for example. All liberals are believers in free speech. All real Americans are believers in free speech. So all real Americans are liberals. Notice also what I did here, and you probably always want to do this. Put it into its universal form, with the S, P's, and M's, and circle the distributed terms. And that way you can just look at it and you see right away that both middle terms are undistributed. Right? Now, if we gave a counterexample to this, right, to show anyone, even those who don't believe in Aristotle's rules, that this is a bad argument, this one has the same form. All dogs are mammals, all cats are mammals, therefore all cats are dogs. And here also you can see why we had to learn distribution so that we could apply the rules. I just wasn't making you do it for the heck of it. Remember that universal statements distribute the subjects, while negative statements distribute the predicates. But you can also just think about class inclusion here to sort of understand what's going on. It's almost a sort of common sense thing. Just because every one of the liberals are believers in free speech doesn't mean they're the only ones who believe in free speech. Believers in free speech could be a much broader category than liberals. Indeed, there are many conservatives, libertarians who believe in free speech. All kinds of people believe in free speech, and they don't have to be liberals to do so. Undistributed middles will often suck people in and confuse them if they're not paying attention. It's one of the favorite tactics of the wild beasts out there when they want to make somebody guilty by association. Right? Of course, they won't lay it out for you in standard form to analyze, but you have to use logic to see through it. Here's what I heard somebody say on talk radio the other day. Well, actually, a few years back. But my fellow Americans, I heard on the radio just the other day a recording of an Al-Qaeda terrorist saying they're opposed to the National Surveillance Agency and its surveillance because it breaks American law. Can you imagine that? Can't we trust our leaders to break the law for us when we need them to? And I'll tell you what else I heard. That the Green Party is opposed to NSA surveillance too. So every last member of that un-American Green Party is opposed to it. Do you know what that means? Every last dang Green follower is a terrorist too. Now, if you think about that and try to pull an argument out of all that, you might end up with something like this. Some terrorists are persons who are opposed to illegal NSA surveillance. All Green Party members are persons opposed to illegal NSA surveillance. Therefore, all Green Party members are terrorists. Now, if we put out the universal form here, some P are M, all S are M, all S are P, and we circle our distributed terms, it just sort of leaps out at you that both middle terms are undistributed, which makes it fail the rule, so it's an invalid argument. We can also give a counterexample. We might as well argue that some murderers are opposed to gun control. All members of the NRA are opposed to gun control. So all members of the National Rifle Association are murderers. But of course that's absurd. Right? We have two true premises and a false conclusion. Again, this is called guilt by association. The accusation that someone is a terrorist because they agree with something the terrorist said is a fallacy becomes clear when you think about it and orient yourself in the jungle of words. Our second rule is that if a term is distributed in the conclusion, then it must be distributed in the premise, or in a premise, at least one of them. Right? And the fallacies associated with this are the fallacy of the illicit major and the fallacy of the illicit minor. Now, if a term is distributed in the conclusion, then that means it refers to the entire category or class, remember. And you cannot make claims about an entire category of class based on statements that only refer to part of that class in the premises. Why? Because it's possible that something might be true of part of a class, but still might not be true of the entire class we're talking about in the conclusion. This means that the conclusion is making a stronger claim than the premises will support. If a syllogism fails this rule, then it commits the fallacy of the illicit major if the major term is distributed in the conclusion but not in the major premise, and the fallacy of the illicit minor if the minor is distributed in the conclusion but not in the minor premise. Consider our example here. See, here we have an illicit minor. Consider the argument, all terrorists are extremists, all extremists are radicals, therefore all radicals are terrorists. First thing we do is put it in universal form and circle our distributed terms. And here you can clearly see that the minor term is distributed in the conclusion, but it's not distributed in the minor premise. We can't have a more powerful claim in our conclusion than we have in a premise because it just won't support it. Here we're only talking about part of the class of radicals, while here we're talking about the whole class of radicals. And the counterexample makes clear how bad this argument is. It's like saying all cats are animals, all animals are living creatures, so all living creatures are cats. Now this is a classical tactic of the political beasts out there in the jungle. They're always doing this, right? They won't put it to you in standard form, like I've said before. But when you break it all down, they're always saying stuff like this to try to make people guilty by association. Suppose someone argued, all supporters of tighter restriction of gun ownership are persons who want to reduce random gun violence. No NRA members are supporters of tighter restriction on gun ownership. So no NRA members are persons who want to reduce gun violence. We put it in our universal form, we circle the distributed terms, and we can quickly note that the major term here is distributed in the conclusion, but not in the major premise. This is a fallacy you will often find used on purpose in political debates, where one person wants to claim that if the other person doesn't agree with that person's policies, like, say, stricter gun control, that they don't also accept their broader goal of reducing gun violence. But people can share a goal while still disagreeing on how to reach it. Now, the counterexamples are so clear that they just sort of leap right up and bark at you, as it were, or grab your attention. And if you feel like mocking the person you're arguing with, I don't know why you'd want to do that unless they were mocking you. You might say, well, that's just as if you argued all dogs are animals, no cats are dogs, so no cats are animals. What arguments like this are really saying is, one, if you don't agree with my methods or policies to reach a goal, like here, tighter restriction on gun ownership, two, then you don't accept those goals, reducing gun violence. But people can share a goal and still disagree on how to get there. Another example from the news. You might think we need to reduce violence in the streets, right? And you might say that there are different ways to get there. One, you might think, might be by beefing up the police, making them more stronger and giving them more powers. Another way you might think of reducing violence in the streets is by decreasing police presence and retraining them to be less confrontational and to use de-escalation tactics. You could both share the same goal of reducing violence in the streets, right? But that doesn't mean because you have a different strategy that you don't agree with it. So someone could say, all this talk of de-escalating the police, you don't really want to reduce violence in the streets, right? But that would commit this fallacy. Now, Rule 3 states a categorical syllogism cannot have two negative premises. In a syllogism, two negatives don't make a positive. In fact, they don't make anything at all. Think about it. If both premises are negative, what do they tell us? Well, they tell us that both the major and minor terms are excluded from each other, wholly or in part, from the middle term, which does not tell us how the major and minor term are positively related. Now, as most people are intuitively aware, a statement about what a thing is not really doesn't carry much information about what that thing is. Suppose I tell you I'm thinking of something that is not a tree. Yes, right now I'm thinking about something that's not a tree. Do you know very much about it? Right? And not much at all, I bet. Since such a syllogism won't give us any positive conclusion to draw because the terms are all excluded from each other, we say it commits the fallacy of exclusive, i.e. excluded premises. Now notice this argument that I heard on talk radio one day, right? Nothing that rich people support helps the poor. You know that, don't you? And government welfare programs are opposed by the rich. They just don't like us taking their money to help the poor. So government welfare programs must help the poor because if the rich are against it, it must be good. Now, using the principle of charity, we make this the best possible argument we can. Right? And we end up with something like, no things that rich people support are things that help the poor. Some government welfare programs are not things that rich people support, so some government welfare programs are things that help the poor. Now, we put this in universal form. We get no M or P, some S are not M, and some S are P. No problem with that, right? The middle term's distributed, but there's another problem. We've got a universal negative, a particular negative, and a particular affirmative, right? What is it? It's an EOI1, right? And it breaks our rule, right? So if we have a counterexample, we could say, well, that's as if you said no mammals are fish. Some whales are not fish, so some whales are not mammals. If you think about it, what's going on here is we're trying to connect the S and P classes. We're trying to claim that at least one member of the S is in the P, but up here we have no basis to support that. Now, Rule 4 tells us that a negative premise must have a negative conclusion. And if a fallacy has this problem, it's called the fallacy of drawing an affirmative conclusion from a negative premise. Consider our example here. No caused actions are free actions. Some human actions are not caused, so some human actions are free actions. We put it in universal form, but even before we do that, we can notice we have two negative premises right here, but we have a positive conclusion. Right? Even if we just had one negative premise, we'd have to have a negative conclusion. That's what the rule says. A negative premise must have a negative conclusion. So this fails Rule 4, and it's invalid. And our counterexample can help make this clear. That's just as if we had argued, no fierce cats are birds, some cats are fierce cats, so some cats are birds. Now, Rule 5 tells us that a negative conclusion must have a negative premise. And if a fallacy does this, it commits the fallacy of drawing a negative conclusion from affirmative premises. Now, think about it. A negative conclusion claims that the minor term is either completely or partially excluded from the major term. But if both of the premises are affirmative, then they both assert class inclusion and not exclusion. That means that they are not strong enough to support a negative claim. A syllogism that does this then commits the fallacy of inferring a negative conclusion from affirmative premises. Or you could just in shorthand say, the fallacy of negative conclusion / affirmative premises. You don't have to write all that out. Consider my example. All empiricists are lovers of logic, all atheists are empiricists, and no atheists are lovers of logic. Now here we quickly see we have two universal affirmatives and a universal negative in our conclusion. So we have a negative conclusion, but we don't have a negative premise, right? And so it fails our test. And our counterexample helps make clear why this is such a bad argument. All mammals are animals. All cats are mammals. No, cats are mammals. And maybe you're beginning to see how I would test you on this. I would give you a syllogism. I would tell you to put it into universal form and circle the distributed terms. And then to evaluate it. Does it pass rule 1? Does it pass rule 2? Does it pass rule 3? Does it pass rule 4? It doesn't pass rule 5. Right? So you'd say, it doesn't pass the rule that says a negative conclusion must have a negative premise, which means it commits the fallacy of negative conclusions being drawn from affirmative premises. And then give a counterexample. Of course, arguments out there in the wild don't come so neatly summed up so that their absurdity leaps right at you. Right? Here's another example from talk radio I heard once a few years ago. Oh, atheists say they love logic and reason just because they say they need physical evidence for their beliefs. That's what they say. That's what those people say. But is that all there is to it, brothers and sisters? I tell you, no atheists love logic or reason. How could they, when they don't love the God that made them? And as I sat there in the car by the side of the road, I thought to myself, well, my brother on the radio there, that's just as if you had argued all Bible believers are followers of Jesus. All Christians are Bible believers, so no Christians are followers of Jesus. The puppies are crying. The logic puppies. Now, Rule 6 tells us that two universal premises cannot have a particular conclusion, and this commits what's called the existential fallacy. But to understand this rule, we have to take a brief excursus in the epistemology of logic, right? In order to understand what this rule means. We'll have to, in fact, do a little bit of philosophy, that part of philosophy that's called epistemology. Now, epistemology comes from the Greek episteme, knowledge, science, plus logos. Oh, you know about logos. They're translating it as theory of knowledge, right? Or, as we might say, the logos of knowledge, right? And it's the branch of philosophy concerned with the nature and scope, as well as the limitations of knowledge. It studies how knowledge is related, it should say, to truth, belief, and justification. It considers the means of production of knowledge, and also considers skepticism about different knowledge claims. And this was summed up for us by James Frederick Ferrier, who lived in the 19th century and gave us a good definition. So that's going to take a whole other lecture. So I'm going to come at you with that lecture next time, and we're going to do some epistemology. Why not? I love to do epistemology, and I hope you will too. Thank you for your kind attention.